Hi guys and welcome to Last Light Radio channel. Tonight we walk into a place that seems quiet from a distance, yet hums with strain, money, fear, and the rustle of cotton leaves under a hot Mississippi sky. You may picture white fields glowing softly in the sun, grand porches facing the river, and slow wagons creaking along dusty roads. But what did that beauty cost? And who paid for it with their hands, their sleep, and their stolen years? You step into 1850, where cotton is treated like a miracle, even though the miracle is really forced labour hidden behind neat rows and ledgers. So, before you settle into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and while you are here, tell me your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, and let the darkness settle gently around you as you enter Mississippi in the middle of the Cotton Kingdom, where the night air smells of damp earth and chimney smoke, and where nearly every road seems to lead toward a plantation. You arrive in a land that is rich, wet, and deeply uneasy. Mississippi in 1850 feels young and old at once. The state is only a few decades into its life, yet the social order already acts ancient, as if it were carved into stone by nature itself. Thick forests have been cut back in many places. Fresh clearings open into broad fields. Tree stumps crouch in the soil like broken teeth. The land beside the Mississippi River is especially prized. Dark and fertile. A deep alluvial earth that planters praise with almost religious feeling. They speak of soil the way poets speak of love. You can hear the vanity in it. The mornings begin with mist hanging low over the ground. Frogs mutter in ditches. Insects start their dry singing before the heat fully rises. There is a smell of mud, cane, smoke, sweat, and livestock. Sometimes a breeze slides across the fields and offers a moment of relief. Then it is gone. By noon, the air presses against your skin like a heavy damp blanket, and everything feels slower except the work. Cotton rules this place, not just as a crop, but as a system. Cotton shapes where roads are cut, where stores appear, where money flows, and where violence hides under polite conversation. In 1850, Mississippi stands among the leading cotton states in the United States. The demand from textile mills, especially in Britain and the American North, keeps prices high enough to feed fantasies of endless expansion. Planters boast, merchants smile, bankers lend, land speculators circle like patient birds, and at the centre of the whole thing are enslaved black Americans, whose labour turns seed into profit, field into fortune, and punishment into routine. You begin to see that a plantation is not just a farm, it is a machine made of people. Some plantations are modest by the standards of the wealthy class, with a few dozen enslaved workers and a plain main house. Others are large operations with hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children living in rows of cabins and labouring across vast acreage. The grandest homes display columns, polished furniture, imported fabric, silverware, and books. Visitors may be invited to supper, where the table gleams in candlelight and conversation floats over roast meat, biscuits, preserves, and coffee. A stranger could almost believe the owners live in refinement untouched by dirt. Yet the refinement rests on forced labour at every turn. The house is cleaned by enslaved hands. The food is planted, harvested, cooked, and carried by enslaved hands. The cotton that pays for the silver is planted and picked by enslaved hands. Even the quiet is managed by fear. You walk farther from the big house and reach the quarters, where the truth is less decorated. The cabins are usually small, rough wooden structures, sometimes with stick and mud chimneys, sometimes with badly fitted boards that let in wind, dust, and insects. Several people may sleep in one cramped room. The floor can be packed earth or rough planks. Bedding is scarce. Clothes are patched and repatched. A kettle hangs near the fire. The scent of ash lingers in fabric. Cornmeal, pork, molasses, and whatever can be grown, trapped, or gathered help people survive. The nights hold low voices, crying infants, coughs that do not quite stop, and songs that drift into the dark. You are not supposed to linger here. That alone tells you something. Plantation owners like to describe themselves as providers, protectors, and managers of an inferior race. Their language was soft. Their system was not. In account books, enslaved people might be listed by first name, age, task, monetary value, and condition: healthy, strong, good breeder, likely field hand, prime boy, prime woman. The words are cold, clipped, and efficient. Human life becomes inventory. A child can be counted beside a mule, a wagon, or a cotton gin. That is one of the ugliest truths in this world. Slavery in Mississippi is not an accidental cruelty. It is organized, priced, and defended. And defended with great energy. The year 1850 sits inside a tense national moment. Laws and politics swirl around slavery, but on the plantation those debates often feel far away, like thunder somewhere beyond the horizon. What matters here is control. Enslavers fear resistance, escape, poison, fire, slowness, literacy, meetings, travel without permission, and sometimes even laughter they cannot interpret. That fear shapes daily rules. Patrols move through roads and woods. Passes are demanded. Doors are watched. People are counted. A gathering can look suspicious simply because joy is dangerous in a place built on domination. Historians still argue over exactly how much freedom of movement varied from plantation to plantation, because records often reflect the claims of owners rather than the lived experience of the enslaved. Some planters insisted they ruled with a light hand. Diaries and letters sometimes repeat that flattering version, but punishment records, testimony, and the logic of the system tell a harsher story. Power here depends on the constant possibility of force, whether used openly or hanging silently in the air. You can feel that silence. It's in the posture of people stepping aside when white riders pass. It is in the quick lowering of the eyes. It is in the way a conversation changes when an overseer appears at the end of a path. The overseer is often the visible edge of plantation discipline. Hired to push labour and report problems. Some are remembered as brutal men with sharp tempers and whips always near at hand. Others are described as quieter, which in this context does not mean kind. It may simply mean predictable. On a plantation, predictability can feel like mercy, which is a bleak standard indeed. The cotton itself has a strange beauty. When ripe, the bolls burst open into white fibre that catches sunlight and seems almost clean. The illusion is powerful. Cotton can look soft as cloud and innocent as snow, yet growing it demands hard, repetitive work. The fields must be cleared, ploughed, planted, hoed, weeded, watched, picked, and processed. Every stage leans on human effort. The invention of the cotton gin made short, staple cotton far more profitable, but it did not reduce the need for labour in the fields. In a bitter twist, it expanded slavery by making more land worth planting. That twist changed lives by the hundreds of thousands. Many black Americans on Mississippi plantations in 1850 had not been born there. They had been forced into the state through the domestic slave trade, marched or shipped from the Upper South as cotton spread westward. Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas sent people south in chains, coffles, wagons, and riverboats. Traders advertised them. Buyers inspected them. Families were torn apart with sickening regularity. A mother could be separated from a child, a husband from a wife, siblings from one another. The grief was ordinary here, which may be the darkest thing of all. A horror repeated often enough can begin to look normal to those who profit from it. There is a quirky detail that survives in some plantation records and travellers' remarks, and it sits oddly against the brutality. Certain planters prided themselves on naming plantations with theatrical grandness, borrowing names from classical history or romantic literature, as if an estate called Magnolia Grove or Mount Ariel could hide the labour camp underneath. The contrast is almost absurd. A poetic name over a place of compulsion, gentle branding for organised suffering. Even in 1850 the performance was elaborate. You move along a wagon path and hear the distant groan of a cotton gin. It is not a pleasant sound. It grinds and clacks with mechanical indifference, turning picked cotton into something closer to market. Nearby, loose fibres drift in the air and cling to clothes and skin. The gin house smells of oil, dust, wood, and lint. Bales will eventually be pressed, wrapped, marked, and sent toward market towns and river landings. Cotton moves outward, wealth returns inward, the labourers remain. What happened to black Americans on these plantations was not only physical exhaustion, though there was plenty of that. It was a continual assault on autonomy. Your time was not yours. Your body was not legally yours. Your children were not securely yours. Marriage had no full legal protection. Worship could be monitored. Learning to read could invite punishment. Even grief had to fit around the workday. Imagine living where every plan can be interrupted by someone else's command. Imagine hearing your own name spoken as property, and yet people made lives within those confines. That matters. In the quarters, people formed families whenever possible, whether recognized by slaveholders or not. They cooked, mended, joked, courted, prayed, and sang. They nursed the sick with limited means. They passed down stories, names, and skills. Some fished in creeks or trapped small animals. Some tended tiny garden patches if allowed. Okra, peas, greens, sweet potatoes, and corn could become the difference between hunger and endurance. Food had smell and memory. A pot simmering at night carried comfort even when the ration was meagre. Smoke from the fire settled into hair and cloth. The heat of the kettle warmed tired fingers. These are small things, but in hard lives, small things become large. You also notice the presence of skilled labour hidden inside the plantation world. Not every enslaved person worked only in the cotton rows. Some were blacksmiths, carpenters, coopers, drivers, domestic servants, cooks, seamstresses, nurses, or boatmen. Their tasks varied, and sometimes their movement did too. A skilled person could hold a certain practical value that changed daily treatment in limited ways, but skill did not cancel enslavement. It simply gave the system more uses for your body. A talented carpenter could build fine furniture and still be sold. A trusted cook could serve dinner in the big house and still have no control over her own future. There is another uncertainty scholars continue to explore. Historians disagree about how often paternalistic language from slaveholders actually shaped everyday relationships in a meaningful way, or whether it mainly functioned as self-serving fiction. The surviving sources are uneven. Owners wrote a great deal about their own benevolence. Enslaved people had fewer chances to leave written testimony from that exact place and moment. What becomes clear, though, is that any kindness existed inside coercion, a system that allows sale, beating, surveillance, and forced labour cannot be softened into innocence by a few polite gestures. Even religion, which many owners encouraged in controlled forms, carried double meanings. White ministers might preach obedience. Enslaved listeners might hear something else in the stories of Exodus, bondage, judgment, and deliverance. A single sermon could contain two worlds. In one, power stays where it is. In the other, Pharaoh eventually falls. You can almost feel the quiet electricity of that difference. As evening approaches, the plantation changes tone. The sky turns amber, then violet. Mosquitoes rise in hungry swarms. Frogs begin again. Smoke climbs from cabin chimneys. Field tools are stacked away. A child leans against a doorway, half asleep. Someone hums while stirring a pot. Someone else rubs aching wrists. The great house glows with lamplight while the quarters flicker with firelight. Two kinds of evening share the same land and mean very different things. You stand in that fading light and understand the central fact. Black Americans on cotton plantations in Mississippi in 1850 were made to live inside a system built to extract labour, profit, obedience, and even reproduction from them. They were denied legal freedom, exposed to sale and punishment, and forced to sustain the wealth of others. But they were never merely what the system said they were. They remained thinking, feeling, remembering people who built families, preserved dignity, shared knowledge, and carried inner lives that no ledger could fully measure. The plantation wants you to see cotton. You learn to see the people. You begin at the river, because so much in Mississippi begins there. The water moves thick and brown under the morning haze, carrying driftwood, insects, rumour, and profit. Flatboats scrape against the landing, Steamboats cough smoke into the pale sky. Ropes strain. Crates thump onto planks. Men shout over one another in the damp air. The smell is a heavy mix of mud, fish, sweat, tobacco, wet wood, and animal waste. It is busy enough to seem ordinary. That is the trick. Places of buying and selling often hide their worst business inside everyday noise. At the landing, people arrive as cargo. Not in official language, perhaps in practice. Yes, by 1850, Mississippi has become a major destination in the internal slave trade. Enslaved black Americans are carried south and west from older slave states, where many white owners have decided that selling people is more profitable than keeping them. Traders move them in groups overland and by water. Some come by coastal ship to New Orleans, then up inland routes. Others come in chained coffles along roads that turn to ruts under wagon wheels in summer rain. The journey itself is an injury. Feet blister, ankles rub raw against irons. Children cry from thirst and fear. Adults try to stay composed because panic can bring immediate punishment. You watch a group disembark under armed supervision. The adults carry almost nothing. A blanket, a tin cup, a bundle tied in cloth. A child with eyes swollen from crying clings to a woman's skirt. Another child stares at the river with the flat, shocked expression of someone too young to understand the size of the loss, and old enough to feel it anyway. The trader keeps count. Numbers matter more to him than names. He checks a list, glances at teeth, shoulders, posture, and says something brisk to a clerk. The clerk dips a pen into ink. Paper makes ownership look civilized. People are cleaned up before sale when possible. That detail tells you a great deal. Hair may be cut, faces washed, skin rubbed with grease to look healthy. Torn clothes are sometimes replaced with garments meant to give an impression of strength and order. Traders know the market. They understand display. They arrange people by age, sex, and supposed ability, much as livestock dealers sort animals. This comparison appears in letters, bills of sale, and recollections, and it remains nauseating every single time. A person can be made to stand, turn, lift an arm, open the mouth, and answer questions as strangers inspect the body for profit. The auction yard can be public or semi-private. Sometimes it takes place in a town, sometimes in a trader's pen, sometimes in a courtyard where buyers move with deliberate calm, trying not to look too eager. The setting varies. The humiliation does not. Men may be asked about field experience, carpentry, blacksmithing, boatwork, or health. Women face all of that, plus the crude, invasive interest of buyers who see labour, domestic service, and childbearing potential in the same body. Teenagers are judged as future value. Younger children may be sold with a parent, though no one should mistake that for mercy. Families are often separated if higher prices can be gained by dividing them. This is where language becomes especially ugly. Prime, likely. Sound, fancy girl, good with children, excellent field hand. The words flatten a person into a category and then into a price. A man who once farmed a small patch for his own family in Virginia can become a line in a Mississippi ledger. A woman who knows herbs, songs, stories, and 3 ways to stretch a meal becomes a number with a $sign beside it. A child becomes future increase. The market speaks with cheerful brutality. Some sales are called private, but privacy does not soften the act. It only mutes the audience. You stand near a pen built from rough boards. The yard is hot. Flies gather at the corners of eyes and mouths. A chain clinks somewhere behind the wall. Buyers step inside one by one or in small groups. The trader gestures with forced friendliness. He may swear that the people for sale are obedient, strong, and free of defects. He may lie. In fact, lying is so common that buyers themselves complain about it. There are stories of people being dressed to hide scars, coached to answer in certain ways, or kept from speaking too freely. Historians disagree over how much room enslaved people had to influence these moments, but they do know that some tried. A person might emphasize one skill, conceal an illness, or seek a buyer who seemed less immediately violent. These were narrow choices inside a monstrous structure, but narrow choices could still matter. Children feel the terror differently and no less deeply. A small child may not grasp the geography of what is happening, yet can sense the collapse of safety with frightening speed. Strange voices, strange hands. A mother's breathing changes. Adults whisper at night. The road never seems to end. Some children become very quiet. Others cry until they are hoarse. Traders sometimes separate children from parents by promising reunion, which was often false. In other cases, they sell infants with mothers only because buyers believe that very young children are easier to control if attached to a parent's labour. Even tenderness can be twisted into business. One odd and chilling detail appears in some accounts of traders on the move. They sometimes forced coffles to sing or march in rhythm to create an appearance of cheerfulness when passing through towns. Imagine the insult of that. Suffering made to perform contentment for the comfort of onlookers. A song that might once have held community can be pressed into service as camouflage. It is theatrical cruelty, polished just enough to help the public look away. Once purchased, the journey to the plantation begins. Some buyers take people directly from town to rural estates by wagon, horseback escort, or on foot. The road stretches through pine woods, cane brakes, muddy crossings, and newly cut fields. Dust rises in dry weather and sticks to sweat. After rain, the wheels sink deep. Mosquitoes whine around ears and necks. There is often little conversation because fear sits in every throat. A new owner may ask practical questions. Can you plough? Can you spin? Can you cook? Do you know cotton? The answers may shape the labour assigned, though not the basic fact of bondage. You notice that the landscape itself participates in the shock. Mississippi can feel lush almost to excess. Vines climb trees, cicadas pulse in the heat, water glimmers in ditches, birds vanish into reeds. It would be beautiful if it were not also the setting of forced arrival. The natural world keeps doing what it does. Human beings create the nightmare within it. The contrast is hard to shake. Sunlight falls softly on a wagon carrying people into slavery, as if nature has chosen not to comment. At a plantation gate, the sale becomes daily life. The new arrivals may be lined up and looked over again by the owner, the overseer, and sometimes enslaved workers already on the place. The scene is tense for everyone. The buyer is measuring usefulness. The overseer is estimating how much pressure will be needed. The enslaved community is trying to read danger, character, and grief all at once. New people mean fresh stories, fresh skills, fresh sorrows, and sometimes news from parents, spouses, children, or siblings left behind in other states. A familiar surname can stop the breath for a second. A place name can reopen a wound. Some planters call this process breaking in, which is revealing language. It suggests taming an animal, not receiving a person. The goal is to teach the rules quickly and stamp out resistance before it spreads. A driver or overseer may explain work times, rations, punishments, passes, and expectations. The explanation can be delivered in a level voice. It is still a threat. New arrivals must learn where to sleep, where to fetch water, where tools are kept, and whom to avoid if possible. There may be a woman in the quarters who quietly shows a frightened child where the firewood is stacked. There may be an older man who explains which creek has fish, and which path is watched at night. Survival begins with information. The first night is often one of the hardest. A cabin full of strangers can feel lonelier than a road. Smoke clings to the rafters. The mattress, if there is one, is stuffed with rough material and alive with insects. Someone coughs in the dark. Someone prays under their breath. Someone tries not to cry and fails anyway. The body is exhausted, but sleep does not arrive kindly. The mind keeps replaying the sale, the voices, the moment a hand slipped from yours in a crowd and did not return. There is another layer to this story that scholars continue to debate. Historians still argue over how often enslaved people were able to maintain kin connections across distance after sale. Because the evidence is scattered and deeply uneven, some families sent messages through boatmen, ministers, traders, or people travelling between plantations. Some never heard another word. The archive catches fragments, a remembered name, a rumour of survival, a letter dictated years later. Silence is everywhere between those fragments. New arrivals also carry knowledge that planters covet without admitting its full value. A woman brought from Maryland may know gardening methods, food ways, and medicinal practices that help others survive. A man from Virginia may understand timber work, mule handling, or drainage techniques. Children bring memory too, even when adults dismiss it. Songs, accents, prayers, names of rivers, recipes, jokes, tiny habits of gesture. All of these travel with the body, enslave us by labour, but they also seize culture and then pretend they created the world around them. In some cases, buyers request particular traits with unsettling precision. They may want young men for heavy field labour, women with experience in spinning and cooking, or entire family groups if they believe family ties will stabilise a workforce. This calculation can sound less savage on paper. It is not. It is management thinking. A planter who buys a husband and wife together may still sell one later without hesitation, if debts rise or ambitions shift. Even arrangements that appear less destructive remain fragile because legal control stays in the hands of the owner alone. There are moments when the humanity of the enslaved breaks through the market language so forcefully that even hostile observers cannot fully suppress it. A mother trying to pull her child back into her arms. A man refusing to mount a sail block. A teenager answering questions with stubborn silence. A group walking into a new place and immediately trying to find relatives by whispering surnames in the dusk. These moments matter because they reveal the lie at the centre of the trade. The trade insists people are property. Their actions insist otherwise. You may wonder whether everyone in these towns simply accepted what they saw. Some did. Some profited directly. Some looked away with practiced ease. A few voiced discomfort, though often without challenging the system itself. Mississippi in 1850 is not full of innocents corrupted by a few bad men. It is a society structured around slavery and law, commerce and habit. Traders need ships, roads, pens, clerks, credit, advertisements, buyers, and officials willing to uphold contracts. The market is social. That is why it is so powerful. By late afternoon, the landing grows quieter. The day's heat begins to loosen. Shadows lengthen over the packed dirt. A steamboat whistle blows somewhere downriver, long and lonely. In the pens and cabins attached to trading yards, people wait for the next sale, the next wagon, the next command. Waiting becomes its own form of pain. It gives the mind too much room and too little hope. Yet even there, people speak softly to each other. They share scraps of food. They calm children. They trade names of places and owners. They measure danger with whatever facts they can gather. That exchange of knowledge is a kind of defense. So when you ask what happened to black Americans on cotton plantations in Mississippi in 1851, part of the answer begins here, at the water's edge and in the market yard. They were uprooted by a domestic slave trade that treated their bodies as capital and their relationships as expendable. They were transported through a landscape of profit and fear into plantations that depended on their labour from the first sunrise onward. They were inspected, priced, bargained over, and assigned like tools. But even in the very moment of sale, they remained more than the sale allowed. They carried memory, skill, attachment, and will into the place that tried hardest to erase all four. The river keeps moving. The people are made to stop. Night settles over the plantation in a way that feels both soft and uneasy. The last colour drains from the sky. Frogs begin their low talk from the ditches. Crickets take up the rest. Smoke lifts from cabin chimneys and hangs in the warm air, carrying the smell of ash, pork fat, damp wood, and boiled cornmeal. The big house glows at a distance with a steadier light, its windows bright like careful eyes in the quarters. The light flickers. Firelight trembles across rough boards, tired faces, kettles, stools, and hands that do not fully stop moving even after the fieldwork ends. This is where life closes in. The cabins are usually built cheaply because comfort for enslaved people is not the point. A planter wants shelter that keeps a workforce alive, not homes that offer dignity. Many cabins are made of logs or rough-sawn planks with gaps that let in wind during winter and insects during summer. Some have dirt floors. Others have uneven boards that catch bare feet and splinters. A chimney may be made of sticks coated with clay. When the clay cracks, smoke wanders back into the room and stings the eyes. Rain can find its way through roof shingles. Heat can become trapped under the low ceiling until the whole place feels like a kettle left near the coals. Several people may crowd into one cabin. Parents, children, a grandmother, a cousin, perhaps even people unrelated by blood but tied by sale and survival. Privacy is scarce. A baby sleeps while someone mends a shirt nearby. An older child curls up beside the hearth because it is the warmest place. A couple speak in murmurs after everyone else seems asleep. The room holds breathing, whispers, snoring, coughing, and those short night sounds of people shifting stiff bodies on rough bedding. Cornhusk mattresses rustle sharply. Blankets smell of smoke and sweat. Lice and fleas are unwelcome but familiar. None of this is accidental neglect. It is the everyday architecture of a system that values labour far above comfort. You feel the texture of life here in small, hard details. The bench is rough under your hand. The cup is tin and dents easily. The spoon may be carved from wood. The fire warms your shins while your back stays cool. The air near the rafters is thick with soot. Grease from supper clings to the kettle. A child leans against a woman's arm and falls asleep before finishing a mouthful. Someone lifts that child gently and lays them on a pallet in the corner. Tenderness survives in tight spaces. The evening meal is rarely grand, but it matters intensely. Rations on many plantations include cornmeal and salt pork, sometimes molasses, sometimes a little flour, occasionally fish or fresh meat, depending on season or location, and the owner's habits. Gardens, if permitted, help stretch these basics. Greens, beans, sweet potatoes, onions, and peas may find their way into the pot. Sometimes people trap rabbits, catch fish, gather berries, or forage wild plants. These additions are not a luxury. They're often what keep hunger from becoming a constant ache. Food carries more than calories. It carries skill, memory, and control over at least one small part of the day. A woman stirs a pot while the fire pops softly. The smell is plain but comforting. Cornmeal thickens, fat rises in glistening beads. Someone tears a piece of bread and passes it to a child without speaking. Someone else laughs at a joke too dry for daylight. That laughter is important. Humour here is not decoration. It is a defence, a release valve, a way of refusing complete defeat. Gentle sarcasm has a place in the quarters too. Human beings have always found ways to poke at power, even when power is holding the whip. After supper, the second shift begins. Not official work, necessary work. Clothes must be washed or patched. Shoes, if anyone has them, need tending. A shirt split at the shoulder cannot wait long because there may be no replacement soon. Women often carry a terrible amount of this burden, though men and children help in different ways. Needles move in dim light. Thread is saved carefully. A torn hem becomes a repaired hem. A larger garment is cut down for a child. Soap, when available, smells sharp and plain. Water hauled from a nearby source chills the hands. Laundry rubbed against a board can scrape knuckles raw. By the time these tasks are done, the body is begging for sleep. Children inhabit the quarters with a strange mixture of freedom and exposure. They are not yet fully pressed into adult labour, though many already work in small ways, carrying water, minding infants, chasing poultry, gathering chips of wood, or helping in gardens. They move between cabins. They absorb words adults think they are not hearing. They learn which paths are safe, which dogs bite, which white men drink too much, which overseers are likely to appear at odd hours. They also play when they can. A stick becomes a toy horse, pebbles become a counting game, a song becomes a rhythm for clapping hands. Childhood is cramped but not erased. Older people in the quarters hold another kind of authority, though slavery tries to crush that too. An elder who is no longer considered fit for heavy field labour may watch children, shell peas, tell stories, tend fires, or offer practical wisdom that no ledger can count. A memory of another state, another parent, a marriage ceremony performed by no official but honoured by a whole community. A remedy for fever brewed from herbs. All of this can rest in an older person's mind. The quarters are not simply a place of exhaustion. They are also a place of transmission. Some of the stories told by firelight are funny, some are cautionary, some carry hidden lessons about tricksters who survive by wit instead of force. Animal tales, spirit stories, biblical images, and local legends mingle together. A clever rabbit can outsmart a stronger enemy. A fool can be undone by greed. A night creature can punish arrogance. These tales entertain, yes, but they also teach alertness, strategy, and patience. Not every lesson can be spoken plainly in a world where ears may be listening from outside the door. There is a curious detail in some recollections from enslaved communities across the South. People sometimes judged time at night not by clocks, which were rare in the quarters, but by sounds and sensations. The first heavy snoring from one cabin, the cooling of the hearth, the moon reaching a certain place through the cracks, the rooster making a mistaken call in the dark. It is a kind of quiet knowledge, practical and poetic at once, in a place where time is owned by someone else. Reading it through smell, temperature rest, and sound becomes a form of intimate expertise, yet fear is always near. The quarters are not fully private. An overseer can appear, a patrol can question movement, a driver can be sent with orders. There may be rules about candles, gatherings, music, or visits between plantations. Some owners tolerate a degree of social life because it makes a workforce more stable. Others distrust any gathering that they did not plan themselves. Historians still argue about how much autonomy enslaved people could exercise in the quarters on different plantations, because conditions varied by owner, crop cycle, and local custom. But variation should not be confused with freedom. Even the most generous-sounding arrangement could be withdrawn overnight. At times, sickness moves through the cabins with terrifying speed. A child burns with fever. A woman coughs deep in her chest. A man lies still after working through pain too long, because missing labour invites punishment or lost rations. Plantation owners sometimes call doctors, especially if they believe valuable property is at risk, but treatment can be delayed, limited, or cruel. Enslaved healers often fill the gap with herbs, poultices, teas, and hard-earned knowledge of the body. Some remedies help, some merely comfort. Comfort matters. A cool cloth on the forehead, a hand held through the night, a voice humming low beside a pallet. These things are not small when formal care is uncertain. Religion enters the quarters in many forms, not always as a formal meeting, sometimes as a whispered prayer while kneading bread, sometimes as a line from scripture remembered and passed around, sometimes as a spiritual sung softly enough not to draw trouble. Biblical stories can be heard in two registers at once. Slaveholders may emphasize obedience. Enslaved listeners often hear endurance, justice, and the possibility that bondage is not the final word. That dual hearing is one of the sharpest acts of mental independence in plantation life. The same text arrives. Different meanings survive. Courtship also finds room here, though room is limited and the risks are serious. A young man may visit another cabin after work if allowed, or slip a few words during an evening task. A young woman may laugh quietly with friends while pretending not to notice him. Affection develops in fragments of time measured by firelight, distance, and supervision. Marriage among enslaved people can be deeply meaningful even when the law refuses to protect it. Couples may jump the broom, speak vows before witnesses, or simply live as husband and wife by mutual commitment and communal recognition. The fragility of these bonds under slavery makes them no less real. It makes them more poignant. Mothers carry a crushing burden in the quarters. They must feed, clean, comfort, and guide children after long days of labour. Their authority is constantly threatened by the fact that the owner claims final control. A mother may tell a child to stay close, speak softly, obey outwardly, remember inwardly, and never forget the names of kin. That instruction is both loving and strategic. Fathers, too, carve out roles in a system designed to weaken them. They repair stools, teach work skills, settle disputes, protect where they can, and pass along hard lessons about surviving white power with as much self-possession as possible. The soundscape of the quarters changes through the night. Early on, there is talk and movement, later, quieter voices. Then only the occasional cough, an infant crying, dogs barking in the distance, wind nudging the walls, insects droning in the dark. The silence is never complete. Plantation life hums even at rest. somewhere a horse shifts in the stable, somewhere a chain on a gate knocks once against wood, somewhere a woman wakes from a dream of home and has to remember where she is. Scholars continue to debate how much the quarters should be understood as a place shaped mainly by the slaveholder's design or by the enslaved community's own remaking of that space. The answer is both, which is precisely why the place feels so charged. The cabins are imposed. The life inside them is created. A crude room becomes a nursery, a kitchen, a sick room, a workshop, a chapel, a school, and sometimes a courtroom of communal opinion. People discipline one another, comfort one another, gossip about one another, and depend on one another. Community is messy. Under slavery, it is also essential. One of the strangest sights to a visitor would be the contrast between what the planter thinks he sees and what is actually happening. He may look toward the quarters and imagine order, dependency, and simple contentment after work. From inside, the reality is layered. There is fatigue so deep that speech feels heavy. There is grief with nowhere safe to go. There is resentment kept under tight control. There is affection, irritation, flirtation, prayer, planning, memory, and the quiet pleasure of sitting near a fire with your shoes off after a brutal day. Human life refuses to flatten. When the night grows late, bodies surrender to sleep in stages. Someone falls asleep mid-sentence. Someone keeps sewing until the needle nearly slips from tired fingers. A woman checks once more that the embers are safe. A man leans his back against the wall and closes his eyes before fully lying down. Children have already gone limp with exhaustion. The room smells of smoke, skin, straw, and the faint sweetness of corn mush left in the pot. It is not peace exactly. It is a pause, and that pause tells you something central about what happened to black Americans on Mississippi plantations in 1850. Slavery did not end when the fieldwork ended for the day. It pressed into housing, food, rest, family, illness, love, and sleep. The quarters were cramped, undersupplied, watched, and shaped by ownership, but they were also where enslaved people built community from almost nothing, preserving tenderness, humor, ritual, and practical knowledge inside a system meant to reduce them to labor alone. The cabins were too small. The lives inside them were not. The day begins long before the sun agrees to it. At first there is only darkness, a damp blackness resting over the fields and cabins. Then a few sounds begin to pry the world open. A rooster calls too early and is answered by another. Someone coughs behind a cabin wall. A baby stirs. Wood knocks against wood as a fire is coaxed back to life. In the distance a horn may sound, or a bell, or the sharp voice of a driver carrying through the dark air. However it happens on a given plantation, the message is the same. Get up. Move. The crop is waiting, and so are the people who believe they own your time. You rise into cold in winter and sticky warmth in summer. Neither asks permission. Feet find the dirt floor or rough planks. A blanket is folded aside. Muscles protest before you even stand. Yesterday's labour still sits in the shoulders, lower back, wrists, knees. The body remembers more honestly than any planter's diary. You pull on the same clothes, stiff with sweat and dust. The shirt scratches, the seams rub. If shoes exist, they may pinch, split, or fill with grit. If they do not, the ground itself becomes the first sensation of the day. Cool mud, dry dust, frost crust, chopped stubble. There is no leisurely wake in here. Everything is compressed. A woman bends over the coals and blows until a red glow returns. Smoke rises quick and bitter. Someone stirs cornmeal in a pot with sleepy efficiency. A child half wakes, then curls back into the blanket because their own work may begin later. A man splashes water on his face from a basin that smells faintly of iron. In many cabins, breakfast is plain and hurried. Corn mush, a scrap of pork if any remains, cold bread from the night before. Some swallow only a few bites because the call to assemble comes too soon. Hunger learns to wait until it cannot. Outside, the plantation is only outlines. Trees stand like shadows cut from darker paper. Stars still cling to the sky in the west. Breath shows pale in cold months. In warm weather, the air already feels damp against the skin. full of the smell of wet leaves, livestock, chimney smoke, and earth that never seems fully dry. Men and women step from cabins and gather tools, hoes, sacks, baskets, plough gear. Voices are low. No one spends words carelessly this early unless they must. The day is long enough without offering extra strength to conversation. Children old enough to work join the movement. That age can be younger than comfort would like to imagine. A child may begin by carrying water or minding younger siblings in the fields, then graduate to tasks like picking cotton, dropping seed, weeding, or scaring birds from planted rows. Work enters the body early and teaches it harsh lessons. Keep pace. Notice commands quickly. Protect your hands if you can. Do not attract attention for the wrong reason. Childhood exists here, but labour keeps pushing into it. By first light, the gang is moving. On many plantations, labour is organised in groups under a driver or overseer. The exact arrangement varies. Some owners divide work by age, sex, strength, or skill. Some use tasks like expectations for certain jobs. But cotton labour in Mississippi often leans heavily on gang work, especially when fields are large and supervision is strict. The line of workers crosses the yard or road and heads toward the fields, shoulders squared against the morning. A wagon creaks nearby. Mules snort and stamp. Harness leather smells sharp and animal-rich. Dew wets hems and bare ankles. For a fleeting moment, the fields can look peaceful under the first pale wash of dawn. Then the work begins, and peace disappears. Spring and summer bring one rhythm of effort. Planting, chopping, hoeing, thinning, weeding. The soil must be opened, seed dropped, rows kept clear, cotton demands repeated attention, weeds rise greedily in southern heat. A field left untended turns unruly fast. Hoe work is especially punishing because it bends the back and drives force through the shoulders hour after hour. Metal bites the ground with a hard scrape and thud. Dirt clings to skin. Sweat comes early. Hands blister, harden, split, then harden again. At sunrise, the day is merely difficult. By noon, it becomes an argument between flesh and command. You hear the field before you fully understand it. Hoes striking, mules straining in harness, an overseer shouting correction, insects whining, leaves hissing in a light breeze. Sometimes there is singing, though not always. White observers often romanticize songs in the fields, pretending they signaled contentment. That was nonsense. Singing could set rhythm, pass feeling, carry a joke, mock authority in veiled language, or simply keep the mind from sinking under repetition. Silence and song both belong to labour. Neither should be mistaken for happiness. When summer deepens, the heat becomes another overseer. It presses down without mercy. Shirts darken, hair sticks to the neck, dust pastes itself to sweat. The sun reflects off open ground and seems to strike from below as well as above. Water breaks may be limited and watched. A person who slows too much risks attention. A person who pushes too hard risks collapse. There is no comfortable pace. There is only the least punishing one that circumstances allow. The skilled workers around you know how to move with economy, how to swing the hoe without wasting motion, how to shift weight, straighten briefly, then bend again. These small efficiencies are a form of survival. Historians still argue over how consistently quotas were imposed in the Cotton South during different stages of cultivation, because plantation records often dwell more on harvest totals than on daily expectations in the field. But there is little doubt that pressure was constant. Even where no number was spoken, the standard existed in the overseer's temper, the owner's ambitions, and the punishment waiting for those judged slow, weak, or disobedient. The harvest season brings the labour most people picture when they think of cotton. The bolls open white against the brown and green, and every field seems dusted with little clouds. It looks almost pretty from a distance. Up close, it is prickly work. Cotton bolls can cut fingers with their dry husks. You pull the fibre free, stuff it into a long sack slung over your shoulder, and keep moving down the row. The sack drags heavier as the day lengthens. Cloth rubs the neck raw. The lower back burns. Hands sting. Small cuts gather lint and dirt. Weight grows by the hour. So does the fear of not meeting expectation. Picking is repetitive in the cruelest way. Reach, pull, stuff. Reach, pull, stuff. Step, bend, reach. The line of movement becomes almost mechanical, but the body never stops feeling it. Children may pick too, moving faster than their size suggests because they have learned the cost of being seen as useless. Women carry sacks and sometimes pregnancies at the same time. Older people who can no longer chop or plough with strength may still be expected to pick if their hands can move. There is no respectful retirement in slavery, only changing usefulness. At intervals, the cotton is weighed. This moment can tighten the whole body. The scale decides whether the day's effort will be called sufficient or treated as failure. Weighing stations become small theatres of judgment. A sack is lifted. A number is announced. Someone meets the mark and exhales inwardly. Someone falls short and tries not to let panic show. Punishment may come later, but the dread starts immediately. On some plantations, those who exceed expectations may be praised in order to push others harder. Praise under coercion has a sour taste. It is simply another tool. One curious detail from plantation culture is the importance some owners attach to competition among the enslaved, as if turning labour into a contest could hide the violence underneath. They boasted of their fastest pickers, recorded astonishing weights in journals, and treated those numbers like signs of managerial genius. What those records really reveal is a system obsessed with extracting every possible ounce of work from exhausted people. Bragging rights built on torn fingers and aching spines are a bleak sort of vanity. The overseer's role sharpens during the workday. He rides, walks, or stations himself where he can observe the line. He watches for slowing, talking, tool misuse, and any sign of resistance. Some bark constantly, others save words and rely on sudden bursts of anger. Either way, his presence reaches into the body like a hook. Even when he is at the far end of the field, workers feel him. White planters sometimes like to imagine the labour process as orderly and paternal, but daily fieldwork shows the truth more plainly. Cotton demanded supervision because the enslaved owed no natural loyalty to the men forcing them to labour. Control had to be renewed every day. Meals in the field are brief and inadequate. Midday may bring a pause long enough to swallow cold food carried from the quarters or handed out in simple portions. Cornbread, bacon, molasses, maybe a few vegetables in season. The body craves more, especially during harvest. But the break does not stretch kindly. Workers sit on the ground or stand in shade if any can be found. Shirts steam slightly as sweat cools. Flies gather. A few jokes pass from person to person, flat and tired but welcome. Then comes the command to rise. Weather changes the work but does not reliably stop it. A rain shower can turn rows to slick mud, coat hems, and weigh down the day with extra discomfort. Thunder may rumble while people keep moving because a planter's fear of lost time often outruns common sense. In cold months, fingers stiffen and crack. In hot months, heat makes the air tremble over the rows. Cotton agriculture ties the body to the season so tightly that weather feels less like background and more like an active participant in command. The day's final hours can be the strangest. The body's most tired. The overseer may be least patient. Light changes and makes the field seem to stretch longer. Every row feels one row too many. Yet the work continues until the order to stop arrives. Not when you feel done. Not when your back says enough. When the owner's system says enough. That distinction is the centre of plantation time. Your fatigue does not govern the day. Someone else's profit does. Scholars debate how much room enslaved people had to negotiate pace, feign illness, hide effort, or subtly reshape the work process without immediate detection. The answer was limited but real in some settings. A hoe can strike a little slower. A wagon can take the long way. A hand can save strength where it matters. Such acts were risky and often small, yet they remind you that labour under slavery was never a smooth machine. It was a struggle over speed, energy, obedience and will, repeated from dawn to dusk. As sunset approaches, the fields change colour. White cotton dulls to grey. Dust settles lower, Insects rise again. Someone straightens up and presses a hand to the small of the back. Someone else rolls sore shoulders. The sacks are gathered. Tools are counted. The gang turns toward the quarters with the dragging, uneven rhythm of people who have already given too much and are expected to give a little more once they get home. The walk back can be quiet. It can also hold a murmured conversation, especially if the overseer has ridden ahead. News may pass down the line. A child is sick. A woman has had a baby. A trader came by. The owner is in debt. Such fragments matter because information is one of the few resources not fully rationed. By the time you reach the cabins, the sky is going gold at the edges and smoke is rising again. The day in the field is over, but the plantation has not released anyone from its grip. Still, what you have seen from first waking to last light is enough to answer one crucial part of the question. What happened to black Americans on Mississippi cotton plantations in 1850 was that their days were seized at the root. Mourning itself belonged to the system. Their strength was measured out in rows and weighed in sacks. Their bodies were pushed through heat, fatigue, supervision, and fear from darkness to darkness. And still they kept walking. That Gewa too is part of the truth. By the time the cotton is ready to pick in earnest, the whole plantation seems to tighten. The air itself feels more urgent. Orders come faster. Faces harden. Wagons are checked. Scales are watched. Even the dogs seem restless, trotting near yards and sheds as if they too can sense the season when white fibre turns into money. You step into the rows at harvest time and understand very quickly that this is not simply labour. It is a campaign. The cotton plants stand waist-high or taller in some fields, dry and scratchy, their leaves dusty, their open bowls bright against the fading green. Each bowl is a small trap of sharp edges and soft reward. Your fingers go in for the lint and come back with tiny cuts. At first they sting. Later the sting becomes a background hum, part of the body's agreement with the day. The sack hangs over one shoulder and drags behind, long and empty for a little while, then longer and heavier as the hours build. Cloth rubs your neck, fine lint sticks to sweat on your forearms. Dust settles on your tongue and gives every swallow a dry finish. You move row by row with no room for daydreaming. Reach, pull, stuff. Reach, pull, stuff. It sounds simple until your back begins to speak in a language of fire. Cotton picking is a discipline of repeated bending, twisting, lifting, and stepping across uneven ground. The rows seem orderly from a distance. Inside them, the work is messy. Branches catch your sleeves. Husks rake the skin. Hidden roots twist underfoot. Ants crawl up trouser legs. Sunlight bounces off pale cotton and strains the eyes. A person can spend hours inside a landscape that is both monotonous and irritating in 100 small ways. The sack is never allowed to stay small. That is the point. On many plantations, each person is expected to bring in a certain weight by the end of the day. The exact number varies depending on age, condition, and the crop itself, but the principle stays the same. Your effort is converted into pounds, and pounds are converted into judgment. Fast hands become valuable hands, slower hands become suspect hands. The scale waits at the edge of the field or near the gin house like a stern little altar to profit. You can work from dawn until the light fades and still fear that the number will not satisfy. Children feel this pressure early. A small child may begin by carrying water or minding a baby in the shade, but once old enough to pick, they enter the arithmetic of cotton with everyone else. Some learn quickly because there is no kind alternative. Their fingers are small and can move neatly through the bowls, but their backs tire faster, their sacks fill more slowly, and their mistakes draw attention. Imagine being measured in pounds before you're tall enough to see over the plants. That is one of the quiet obscenities of the harvest. Women work the rows beside men, and their burden is often doubled by everything waiting at the cabin later. White observers sometimes praised enslaved women for cheerfulness, patience, or stamina, which is a very elegant way of admitting that the labour demanded from them was relentless. A pregnant woman might still be sent into the field. A nursing mother might work under intense pressure and return only briefly to a child. A woman who had spent the night with a sick infant could still be judged by the same scale as someone who had slept. Slavery did not acknowledge the body's complexity unless it interfered with profit. Older workers remain in the line too, sir, when they can. An elderly person with stiff hands and a bent spine may still pick, though more slowly, or be given related tasks around the edges of fieldwork. There is little sentimentality in this arrangement. A lifetime of labour does not purchase rest. It usually purchases more labour until the body can no longer be made useful enough to matter. Even then, many continue working in some capacity, because survival inside the quarters requires contribution where possible. The overseer circulates through this scene like concentrated tension. He may ride a horse along the edges, boots dusty, voice sharp, hat brim low over the eyes. He may dismount to inspect sacks and hands more closely. He may carry a whip openly, or let reputation do the work of display. Some men sneer, some keep their faces flat. Either way, the message is constant. Move faster, talk less, fill the sack. There is little mystery about his role. He exists to convert fear into cotton. Yet fear is not the only thing in the rows. There is also skill. A practiced picker develops techniques that outsiders often fail to notice. Fingers learn how to strip a bowl quickly without pulling too much stem and leaf. The body finds a rhythm that wastes as little motion as possible. A worker may shift the sack with a jerk of the shoulder at just the right moment. Someone may know which parts of the row hold fuller bowls and how to approach them without losing pace. These are real forms of expertise. Planters depended on them completely while pretending the people who possessed them were simple and interchangeable. The contradiction sits right there in the field, plain as daylight. There is a curious detail in some plantation accounts. Owners sometimes staged informal contests over picking speed and weight, then wrote about the results with absurd pride, naming particular workers as if they were racehorses or prize machines. The records can sound almost playful until you remember the conditions underneath. Competition in a slave field is not sport. It is pressure wearing a grin. It can divide workers, flatter a few, punish many, and help the owner imagine that extraction is a kind of game. It was one more lie wrapped around the labour. When sacks grow heavy, workers drag them to a collection point or empty them into larger containers. Depending on local practice, cotton is bulky, light for its size at first, then maddeningly burdensome in quantity. A full sack resists every step. It pulls the shoulder backward and grinds against the lower spine. The cloth scratches the neck where sweat has already made the skin tender. Some workers lean forward sharply while carrying the load, almost as if bowing to the field itself. It is a posture made by weight, not respect. Then comes the weighing. A sack is lifted to the scale. Numbers are called. A clerk may write them down. The air around the scale often feels tighter than anywhere else on the plantation. Here the whole day is judged in a moment. A strong output can bring no real reward beyond temporary avoidance of punishment. Though some owners hand out token treats, praise, or tiny privileges to encourage competition, falling short, by contrast, can bring scolding, threats, reduced rations, extra work, or physical punishment. The scale has no mercy because the people running it do not need it to have any. Historians still argue over how standardized these daily quotas were across Mississippi plantations, since surviving records differ in detail and many owners recorded only what mattered to them financially. But no matter the exact numbers, the culture of measurement was central. The harvest turned human effort into a visible tally that white managers could compare, rank, and use as leverage. In that sense, the scale was not merely a tool. It was an instrument of discipline. Once weighed, the cotton moves toward the processing. You follow the path from field to gin and see how carefully the plantation organizes the transition from exhausted hands to marketable fibre. The gin house is noisy and dusty, full of motion that feels both industrial and improvised. Cotton arrives in heaps. Seeds are separated from lint by machinery, whose clacking rhythm is oddly relentless, almost cheerful in its disregard for the body that gathered the crop. The building smells of oil, dry fibre, wood shavings, sweat, and hot metal. Lint floats in the air and settles on clothes, hair, lashes, nostrils. People cough. The work continues. Not everyone in this stage is a field hand. Some enslaved workers are assigned to the gin house, bale pressing, wagon loading, mule handling, or guarding against fire. Fire is a constant danger because cotton lint is so dry and the machinery so active. A spark in the wrong place can become catastrophe. This risk makes the gin house one of the plantation's most anxious spaces. White owners who might speak grandly of honour and civilization can become almost childishly frantic about the possibility of losing a crop to flames. Profit gives fear a very sharp edge. Baling is another form of force. Cotton must be compressed, tied, marked, and prepared for shipment. Great pressure goes into making the fluffy harvest compact enough to move economically. The irony is hard to miss. First the plant resists the hand, then the fibre resists the press, and at every stage the system responds with more effort extracted from enslaved bodies. The finished bale looks solid and impressive, a neat package of value ready for market. It hides the scratches and sweat and hours packed inside it. Wagons creak under the load as bales are hauled toward river landings or town depots. Mules strain in harness. Wheels sink into soft ground after rain. Drivers curse. Dust rises in dry weather and coats the ropes. Marks on the bale identify ownership or destination. To merchants and brokers, these marks signal opportunity. To the people who made the bale possible, they are just another sign that labour is leaving while they remain. Cotton travels. They do not. You begin to see how the field, the scale, the gin, and the wagon are all part of a single chain. The owner likes to imagine himself as the mind of that chain, but in practical truth the system depends on layers of black knowledge, endurance, and improvisation. Enslaved men and women know how to read the crop, handle the plants, manage the animals, operate the rhythms of harvest, and keep production moving despite weather, fatigue, and poor equipment. White control structures the work, but black skill makes it function. That fact is everywhere and rarely admitted. The rows also contain quieter battles. A worker may hide fatigue behind a steady face. Someone may save a bit of energy by adjusting pace when the overseer looks away. Another may help a child fill a sack a little more quickly, passing along technique without drawing notice. A woman may exchange 3 whispered words with a man several rows over, enough to steady his spirits for an hour. These acts are small, but the plantation relies on the idea that only the big gestures count. In truth, life under compulsion is often shaped by the tiny exchanges that keep people human in the middle of machinery. The sounds of the harvest day linger after the work stops. Cotton rustling against cloth, sacks dragging over dirt, scales creaking, gin teeth rattling, wagon axles groaning, voices counting pounds, a horse stamping at flies. These noises form the soundtrack of wealth in Mississippi in 1850. They also form the soundtrack of theft, because every pound represents labour seized from people who do not own the fruit of their own work. By late evening, the gin house light may still burn, and some labour continues after field hands leave the rows. The plantation does not waste daylight, and it tries not to waste dark either. You can feel the pressure radiating outward from the harvest, touching cabins, kitchens, yards, animals, wagons, and ledgers alike. Cotton season swallows the whole place. It sharpens discipline, magnifies exhaustion, and reveals the central logic of the plantation more clearly than almost any other moment. What happened to black Americans on Mississippi cotton plantations in 1850 can be seen plainly in these rows and weighing stations. They were forced into a harvest regime that measured their worth in pounds, cut their hands on dry husks, bent their backs under sacks, and turned every day into a contest with punishment waiting at the scale. Their labour passed through gin houses and presses into bales that made other people rich. Yet even there, their expertise shaped the process at every step, and their endurance made the plantation possible despite the cruelty of the system. The cotton looked soft. Nothing about the work was... On a Mississippi plantation, no one is allowed to be merely one thing. A woman is expected to be a field hand, cook, mother, nurse, and target of command, sometimes all in the same day. A child is expected to be a child only until the plantation finds a use for smaller hands. An old man is called worn out when it suits the owner. then handed another task the next morning. Labour here spreads across age and gender with a cold practicality that pretends to be natural. It is not natural. It is planned. You notice this most clearly when you stop looking only at the cotton rows and begin looking at who is moving where, carrying what, and under whose voice. Adult men are often pushed toward the heaviest visible tasks: ploughing, ditching, clearing timber, hauling, repairing fences, handling wagons, cutting wood, working with livestock, and of course long hours in the fields. White owners like to describe men as strong backs or good hands, which sounds crude because it is crude. Yet even within that rough category, the labour could differ sharply. A man with skill as a carpenter, blacksmith, cooper, or driver might spend less time in cotton rows and more time turning those skills into plantation value. The skill did not bring freedom. It often brought greater dependence from the owner, and that dependence could be dangerous in its own way. A blacksmith, for instance, could shape hinges, tools, nails, and wagon parts from hot iron while sweat rolled down his temples and sparks jumped in the dim forge. The hammer ring would echo through the yard, bright and hard. The smell of coal, hot metal, and singed leather would cling to his clothes. White owners prized such men because a plantation with in-house skill needed fewer outside purchases and fewer delays. A skilled enslaved man could make the whole place run more smoothly. That practical importance might win him slightly different treatment, but never security. A man valuable enough to keep was also valuable enough to sell for a high price when debt or greed demanded it. Women's labour is even more layered, and that layering is one of the central truths of plantation life. White observers often tried to divide women neatly into field workers or house servants, but the reality was more tangled. Many enslaved women worked in the fields for long hours, chopping, planting, weeding, picking, carrying, and enduring the same heat, cuts and quotas as men. Then they returned to quarters or plantation kitchens for food preparation, laundry, mending, childcare, and the emotional labour of holding family life together in a system designed to keep breaking it apart. The phrase double burden hardly begins to cover it. In the big house or near it, some women cooked, cleaned, spun, served meals, washed linens, tended children, and stayed on call for white households that considered comfort their birthright. Domestic labour could look less brutal from a distance because it happened under a roof and near polished furniture. In truth, it demanded constant attention, long hours, and a dangerous intimacy with white power. A woman in the house might be watched more closely, interrupted more often, and exposed to humiliation or exploitation in ways that were less visible but no less real. Her body and time were still treated as available on command. Then there were women whose labour centred on childbirth, nursing, and care, not because the system respected motherhood, but because it wanted future labourers and healthy workers. Enslaved women were forced to carry children into a world where those children could be sold. They were expected to recover quickly after birth. They were expected to nurse. They were expected to resume work. Some owners boasted about healthy births as if they had managed a successful breeding program, which is one of those phrases that makes your whole mind recoil. The planters' confidence in their own authority did not make the logic less monstrous. Historians still argue over the degree to which planters in Mississippi systematically pressured enslaved women's reproduction as a formal economic strategy in 1850, since practices varied and the evidence is uneven. What is beyond dispute is that slaveholders understood children as future property and often made decisions about women's lives with that fact clearly in view. Motherhood under slavery was never private. Children entered the labour system gradually, then all at once. At very young ages they might scare birds from fields, fetch water, gather chips for fires, carry messages, or mind smaller children. These jobs could be framed as light, almost casual, by owners who wanted to imagine themselves humane. But light work is still work when it trains the body for obedience. A child learns where to stand, when to answer, how to move quickly when called, and how to make themselves useful before anyone asks whether they're tired. As they grew older, children moved into more demanding labour. Girls might be assigned spinning, sewing, kitchen tasks, nursing infants, or field work depending on the plantation's needs. Boys might begin with stock tending, wood hauling, errands, and then graduate to ploughing, hoeing, or wagon work. The shift could happen before the child's body was ready, which tells you how little readiness mattered. What counted was usefulness. Plantation records sometimes mark these transitions in chillingly matter-of-fact terms: child, half-hand, full hand, a whole life narrowed to labour value by stages, and yet children were not merely smaller workers. They were observant. They listened. They learned the moods of white adults with astonishing speed. They knew which commands were real dangers and which were mostly bluster. They collected jokes, songs, and habits from elders. They played in snatches. They teased each other. They sulked. They ran barefoot in dust and dew when no one stopped them. Their humanity did not wait until adulthood to arrive. It was present from the start, which makes the system's treatment of them even more offensive. Older people occupied a precarious place. Once age or injury reduced a person's speed in the fields, the plantation often reassigned them to other tasks: tending children, spinning, shelling corn, feeding poultry, gathering kindling, watching fires, carrying messages. Some became storehouses of memory and practical knowledge, valued deeply within the enslaved community even when dismissed by the white household as worn out or troublesome. An elder might know which herb helped settle a stomach, which creek path stayed drier after rain, which family line connected to another on a neighbouring place, or how to calm a frightened child after a whipping had shaken the whole quarters. One curious detail from plantation records and recollections is how often owners complained that older enslaved people were stubborn, sly, or difficult to manage. Of course they did. An elder who had lived through sale, death, childbirth, hunger, and decades of white command was unlikely to be easily impressed by plantation authority. Age could strip away fear in some cases, or simply replace it with something more complicated. A bent back did not necessarily mean a bent spirit. Physical ability shaped assignments, but so did white ideas about gender that were both rigid and flexible whenever profit required it. Owners talked about women as delicate when showing off their civilization to guests, then sent those same women into punishing field labour. They spoke of men as natural leaders or protectors, then undermined their authority within family life by reserving all final power for themselves. They expected children to be innocent only until the crop needed more hands. They treated elderly people as dependents while extracting labour from them in quieter ways. The plantation's categories were full of hypocrisy. You can hear this hypocrisy in ordinary speech. A planter may call a woman a good mother while selling her child. He may call a man a faithful servant while threatening to whip him for arguing. He may describe an elderly woman as part of the family while housing her in a drafty cabin and measuring her food by ration. The language of affection and hierarchy blends so smoothly that some white people may even believe it. The people living under it know better. Labour also creates relationships among the enslaved that do not fit white expectations. A skilled carpenter may teach a teenage boy how to hold a tool, measure wood, and save his wrists from strain. An older woman in the quarters may teach girls how to wash clothes with less soap, braid hair tightly enough to last through work, or cool a fever with leaves and water. A mother whose own milk is strong may nurse another woman's baby. A young man may carry extra wood to an old couple's cabin without a word about it. None of these acts are dramatic, yet they shape survival more steadily than drama does. There are, of course, tensions too. Hard conditions create friction. A child asked to quiet a baby may resent the task. A woman in the house may be envied for cleaner clothes even though her danger is different. A skilled worker may be resented if the owner favours him. A field hand may think the driver has become too close to white authority. Human communities under pressure do not become saintly. They become human in sharper ways. Loyalty, irritation, tenderness, jealousy, obligation, and weariness all live side by side. Scholars continue to debate how much plantation labour assignments reflected practical necessity versus deliberate social control. The two are deeply intertwined. Assigning a woman to the fields and then to domestic work extracted more labour. Yes, but it also kept her exhausted. Assigning children small tasks early made economic sense to owners, but it also trained obedience. Reassigning elders to childcare or low-visibility work helped maintain the plantation while pulling community knowledge into plantation service. Efficiency and domination move together so closely that separating them can be difficult. In the kitchen yard, this logic becomes especially visible. The kitchen is hot, loud, and full of urgency. Iron pots hang over coals, knives thud on boards, water sloshes in buckets, the smell of onions, grease, ash, and boiling meat fills the air. A cook must time meals for white households with precision while also trying to protect scraps or flavour for her own people when possible. She may command younger helpers and still answer instantly to the mistress of the house. Her expertise is undeniable. Her authority is partial and revocable. That mix of mastery and vulnerability appears again and again in plantation life. Out in the barn or wagon shed, an enslaved boy might learn harness care, wheel repair, and mule temperaments. In the dairy, a woman may rise before others to manage milk, butter, and cleanliness under strict expectation. In the spinning room, hands twist fibre into thread while dust catches in throats. In the yard, toddlers wander under the eye of an old woman who has seen more than anyone asks. At every point, the plantation turns lives into functions while depending on personality, judgment, and intelligence to make those functions work. That is the insult at the core of it. The system insists people are replaceable. The daily routine proves they are not. When evening comes, all these roles return to the quarters together. The field hand with dirt in the seams of his palms. The cook smelling of smoke and lard. The child half asleep but still carrying a smaller child on one hip. The elder with a story and a sore leg. The woman whose day has contained more labour than the ledger will ever show. Each person brings back not just fatigue, but the marks of a role that slavery assigned and the meanings they built within it themselves. So what happened to black Americans on cotton plantations in Mississippi in 1850 cannot be told by speaking only of men in the fields. Women, children, and old people were drawn into the labour regime in different but connected ways. The plantation reached into every stage of life and every kind of body it could command. It made mothers work through exhaustion, turned children into measured labourers, and used elders until usefulness narrowed to a sliver. Yet within that crushing design, people continued to teach, care, improvise, and hold one another up in ways the plantation neither fully understood nor fully controlled. No age was spared. No role was simple. When the workday ends and darkness spreads over the plantation, another kind of gathering becomes possible. Not always easy, not always safe, but possible enough to matter. The cabins breathe out smoke and tired voices. Children drift towards sleep. Dogs bark once, then settle. Somewhere beyond the quarters, under pines or near a brushy hollow. A few people begin to move quietly through the night with the caution of those who know that even comfort may need to be hidden. Religion on a Mississippi plantation in 1850 is never just one thing. White owners often want it to be orderly, supervised, and useful. A good sermon, in their view, should teach obedience, patience, humility, and trust in the structures that keep white people comfortable. A visiting preacher may stand with a Bible in one hand and slavery in the other, urging servants to submit, wives to endure, and masters to be gentle enough to feel righteous. The words can sound smooth. The structure underneath them is rough and obvious. But enslaved black Americans do not hear only what they are told to hear. That is where the story changes. In the quarters, in kitchens, in fields, and on lonely walks between work and sleep. Biblical language can take on meanings that plantation authority never intended to authorize. Egypt is not just a place on a page. It becomes a shadow name for bondage. Pharaoh is not simply a distant ruler in old scripture. He starts to resemble any man who claims ownership over others. Deliverance is no longer abstract. It becomes a living possibility. Perhaps not tomorrow, perhaps not in a way that anyone can safely say aloud, but real enough to warm the inside of a prayer. You step toward one of these hidden gatherings and feel the night air change. Pine sap sweetens the darkness. Damp soil gives off a cool, earthy smell. Leaves brush against your legs. Frogs pulse from a nearby low spot where water collects after rain. The moon is thin tonight, which helps. A bright moon can feel almost like betrayal when secrecy matters. People arrive in twos or alone, taking different paths, pausing to listen, then moving again. A woman carries a shawl around her shoulders. A man keeps his hat low. Someone has wrapped a baby carefully so the child will stay quiet. There are no grand entrances. The danger forbids theatre. Once gathered, the group may form a rough circle or settle among the trees. The place is chosen for cover and for sound. Pines can soften a voice, brush can hide a lantern, a hollow in the ground can swallow song before it travels too far. These practical details matter because worship under slavery often must think like resistance. How loud can you sing without being heard at the road? How long can you stay before someone notices? Which child can be trusted not to wander toward the wrong light in the distance? Sometimes there is no preacher in a formal sense. A woman begins with a line from memory, a man answers with another, someone prays not in polished phrases, but in words that sound like lived need. Lord, keep us. Lord, watch over the children. Lord, bring the sick through the night. Lord, remember the ones sold away. The prayers are full of names, aches, weather, hunger, and fear. They're also full of rhythm. The voice rises, falls, pauses, trembles, and carries. Religious language here is not decoration. It is a shelter built from sound. Singing follows, soft at first. Not performance, not display. A low line carried by one voice and taken up by others. The songs can hold sorrow and steadiness at once. A tune may lean on repetition because repetition lets tired bodies participate, even when words are hard to summon. A line about Jordan, Canaan, crossing over, home, or resting may pass through the group like warm air. White listeners often misunderstood these songs, assuming they were only about heaven or only about resignation. Sometimes they were about heaven. Sometimes they were about endurance on earth. Sometimes they were about escape, memory, warning, or a freedom too large to fit safely into plain speech. Historians still argue over how often spirituals carried direct coded messages on specific plantations, because later memory, popular retelling, and thin documentation can blur the line between symbol and immediate instruction. But scholars broadly agree that these songs carried layered meanings, and that layered meaning itself mattered. Under slavery, speaking in more than one register could be a form of survival. A hand clap begins, slow and deliberate. Feet shift in the leaves. The body joins the prayer. Some gatherings stay quiet and still. Others grow into a ring shout or a movement pattern shaped by rhythm, breath, and communal response. The ring shout is often misunderstood by outsiders, who may see only motion where participants experience spiritual intensity, collective memory, and embodied release. Feet slide and step, hands strike time, voices rise. No one needs a printed program, the order lives in the people. There is a strange beauty in the physical details. Breath clouds faintly in cool weather. Fireflies drift near the edges of the clearing. The rough bark of a pine presses against someone's palm during prayer. A woman wipes her face with the corner of her apron. Not because she is warm, but because something in the song has broken open a pocket of grief she has been carrying all week. A boy too old to be held and too young to hide his feelings leans against an older man's side while the voices swell. A grandmother closes her eyes and rocks with the rhythm, lips moving silently between the louder lines. This worship is not only about escape from pain, it is also about identity. Plantation life tries every day to define people by labour, status, and ownership. Secret worship answers with another definition: child of God, soul, beloved, witness, pilgrim. Those words do not empty the pain, but they refuse the planter's version of reality. That refusal matters. A person who believes they are more than property has not become free in law, but they have protected a vital part of themselves from collapse. White owners often attempt to shape religion for control, and sometimes they succeed in part. Some enslaved people attend supervised church services, hear approved sermons, and navigate the contradictions as best they can. Others distrust white preaching entirely. Most likely, many move between these worlds with practical intelligence, taking what nourishes and discarding what chains. Human beings under domination rarely behave in neat categories. They adapt, listen selectively, test meanings, and carry two conversations in one mind. One curious detail appears in several accounts from the broader plantation south. Some enslaved worshippers used overturned pots, wash tubs, or even wet cloth in secluded places to soften the sound of spiritual gatherings, either by covering prayer or muffling rhythm from carrying too far. Whether every retelling is exact in every place is difficult to prove, but the image rings true because it fits the larger pattern. Worship needed strategy. Even prayer had to learn stealth. Women often play central roles in this spiritual world, though formal leadership in White Eyes is often reserved for men. A woman may lead song, call prayer, interpret a scripture line, comfort the grieving, or keep the whole meeting from falling apart when fear passes through the group. Her authority may not be named in public language, but everyone there can feel it. She knows who is despairing, who is newly arrived, who is carrying a child, who has heard bad news from another plantation, who needs a word placed gently in the right ear tonight. Spiritual leadership is often inseparable from emotional labour. Men to find room here to speak in ways denied to them elsewhere on the plantation. A husband whose authority is constantly undermined by slavery may pray over his family with deep seriousness. A young man who spends the day under command may testify at night to his own worth, sorrow, or hope. An older man may recount a scripture story with a force that turns old words into immediate truth. In a world arranged to humiliate black manhood, spiritual space can offer another register of dignity, not complete safety, not equality, but dignity. Children absorb all of this more deeply than white observers usually guessed. They hear the cadences, they memorize the songs, they learn which biblical figures matter and why. They watch adults transform fear into ritual. They sense which names bring silence into a gathering because the pain around them is too fresh. A child may not grasp every theological turn, but they understand comfort, solemnity, and collective feeling. Spiritual life becomes part of how identity is taught when so many other forms of formal instruction are denied. Scholarly debate remains about the balance between African continuities and Christian adaptation within the religious life of enslaved people in places like Mississippi. Historians have long explored how rhythms, movement patterns, call and response, sacred imagination, and understandings of spirit may have carried forward from West and Central African traditions into the plantation world, even as Christianity became a powerful framework. The debate is not whether creativity happened. It plainly did. The question is how to trace the lines honestly when sources are incomplete and often filtered through hostile eyes. That incompleteness should make you humble, not doubtful. It reminds you that some of the richest parts of enslaved spiritual life were never written down by the people who lived them, either because writing was dangerous, impossible, or simply less important than memory and performance. A hymn can vanish into the air and still do more work than a shelf of documents. A whispered prayer can sustain a person through a week of labour without leaving any trace that a future historian can file. The archive is thin. The life was not. Not every gathering is solemn. Relief has its own holiness. After prayer, there may be a loosened mood, a few quiet jokes, a shared bit of food, a hand squeezed in passing, a promise to watch over someone's child tomorrow if the mother is sent early to the fields. Faith and practicality braid together easily here. The same people asking for divine mercy are also arranging ordinary care. They know the Lord may work through a pot of greens, a hidden poultice, or a warning whispered at dawn. Then the group breaks apart. No dramatic ending, just caution returning. Feet pressing softly into needles and leaf mould. The smell of pine and damp earth again. A final murmur. A hand on a shoulder. A mother lifting a sleeping child. The path back to the cabins feels both longer and lighter. The body is still tired. The plantation still stands. Nothing in the law has changed because a hymn rose under the trees. Yet something has been strengthened. That strengthening is easy to underestimate if you only count visible outcomes. Religion under slavery is not merely comfort in the passive sense. It helps organize memory, preserve moral judgment, and sustain forms of inward freedom that the plantation cannot fully seize. It gives language to grief without letting grief become the only language available. It makes room for hope without requiring foolishness. It allows people to imagine justice in a world structured against them. That is no small thing. So when you ask what happened to black Americans on Mississippi cotton plantations in 1851, vital answer lies under these pines and in these whispered songs. They were drawn into a world that tried to regulate their bodies, labour, families, and movement. Yet they built spiritual lives that exceeded plantation control, finding sacred meaning in hidden gatherings, shared prayer, embodied song, and biblical stories that spoke more truth than the masters intended. The plantation claimed the daylight. Night still belonged partly to the soul. The trees kept the secret. The songs kept the people. A plantation likes open obedience. It likes straight rows, visible labour, quiet backs, prompt answers, and the comforting illusion that power is complete. But power on a cotton plantation is never complete. It is forceful, dangerous, and often overwhelming. Yes, it can beat, sell, surveil, and command. Yet even there, it leaks, it misses things, it misunderstands faces, it mistakes silence for agreement, and in those cracks, enslaved black Americans in Mississippi make room for acts that are small enough to survive and sharp enough to matter. Resistance does not always announce itself. Often it whispers. You see it first in the pace of work, not laziness, calculation. A hoe lifted one fraction slower when the overseer turns his horse. A wagon route chosen with just enough delay to cost minutes, not enough to invite immediate suspicion. A hand that knows exactly how quickly it could move and chooses not to reveal the full speed to those who profit from it. These acts are modest and dangerous. Their modesty is part of their danger. Big rebellion can be crushed in a day. Slow resistance can inhabit years. Plantation owners complained about this constantly without always understanding what they were seeing. They wrote about sullenness, idleness, carelessness, insolence, stubbornness, and poor spirit. Such words reveal more than they intend. They show that the labour system needed more than chains and law. It needed cooperation, and cooperation had to be forced because it was never freely given. A field hand who slows a little is not merely tired, though tiredness is real enough. He may be protecting his body. He may be sharing time with someone weaker nearby. He may be refusing to let the owner have every ounce of life available. Women often practiced resistance in forms that white records notice least well. A cook could stretch ingredients in ways that fed both the planter's table and the quarters. A laundress might damage a garment just enough to embarrass an arrogant mistress, without revealing clear intent. A mother could teach a child what not to say in the big house. A nursemaid might comfort a white infant while quietly refusing the emotional script that claimed she was naturally content in service. These are not grand gestures, but they are choices. Choices matter in a world built to deny choice. Children, too, learned the art of the hidden edge. They could play innocent while observing everything. They could carry messages that seemed trivial to white listeners and urgent to black ones. They could learn who was coming down the road and who had been to Market Town. Sometimes adults underestimated children in order to protect them. Sometimes children understood far more than the adults wished they did. On a plantation, alertness matures early. Small feet can move fast. Small eyes can notice a lot. One boy sent to fetch water may pause long enough at a neighbouring cabin to pass along news that a trader has been seen nearby. A girl in the kitchen might memorise names from a white conversation and repeat them later in the quarters, where those names become warning. Information is one of the few resources that can grow through sharing rather than shrink. That makes it precious. There is resistance in language as well. A white owner may insist on one kind of speech and hearing, but enslaved people often maintain another. Tone, glance, phrase, nickname, and rhythm can carry meanings hidden from those who imagine themselves fully in charge. A polite answer can be sincerely cautious, strategically empty, or quietly mocking, depending on context. Humour plays a role here too. Gentle sarcasm survives in hard places because it allows the powerless to keep a private judgment alive. A man who cannot publicly challenge an overseer can still imitate his strut later in the quarters and draw low laughter from the room. That laughter does not topple the regime. It does something subtler. It punctures the fantasy of a white grandeur. Some acts are more direct. Tools can break. Not dramatically. Conveniently, A hoe handle splits after hard use and poor storage. A harness strap snaps at the worst useful moment. A gate does not latch as securely as it might have. A mule proves difficult because someone let it become difficult. The plantation is full of objects, animals, and routines that need constant care. Enslaved workers provide that care. They can also withhold pieces of it. Such sabotage is risky and often deniable. The owner may blame bad wood, weather, or bad luck. Sometimes that uncertainty is exactly the point. Historians still argue over how widespread deliberate sabotage was on cotton plantations. Because the evidence is slippery by nature, people do not usually confess acts that could get them whipped or sold, and owners often had reasons to interpret accidents as incompetence rather than resistance. But scholars broadly agree that everyday resistance existed in many forms, even when the archive catches only flashes of it. The structure of slavery almost guaranteed friction. Human beings coerced at this scale were never going to become smoothly obedient. Resistance also takes the form of self-preservation. This matters because older writing sometimes romanticized rebellion while overlooking the quiet labor of staying whole. A woman saving a little food for later. A man resting his injured hand in the shadows for 3 breaths instead of 1. 2 friends taking turns encouraging a third person who is near collapse. An elder teaching a child how to read a white mood before danger arrives. These are not dramatic enough for legend, but they preserve lives under slavery. Preserving life against the system's appetite is itself a kind of defiance. Teaching can be resistance too. Formal literacy is often feared by slaveholders, and for good reason. Reading opens doors that white power cannot fully monitor. Even where letters are forbidden, bits of knowledge circulate. Someone who has picked up letters in a kitchen Bible or from a white child's lesson may scratch them into dirt for another person after dark. A man may memorize numbers and names from a ledger he is not supposed to understand. A woman may teach children family histories so they know where they come from, even if the paper record says nothing useful. Knowledge under slavery is not merely information, it is inheritance and leverage. One strange little detail appears in scattered recollections from the antebellum South. Some enslaved people used songs, work calls, or ordinary-sounding phrases to signal changes in mood or risk, without alarming white listeners. The exact examples vary, and not every story can be verified with confidence, but the broader principle rings true. A community under surveillance becomes skilled at layered communication, meaning learns to travel sideways. There is also open resistance, though it is much harder to sustain. People run away. Some flee for a night or a week, seeking a spouse on another plantation or a little breathing room in woods and swamps before hunger. Dogs and patrols drive them back. Others tempt permanent escape, hoping to reach cities, free states, or hidden networks of aid. Mississippi is not easy ground for flight. Distances are long. The river can help or betray. White patrols, posted notices, slave catchers, and armed neighbours all stand ready. Yet people still try, because the attempt itself is testimony to how unbearable the condition is. Short absences, sometimes called truancy by owners, are especially revealing. A person vanishes overnight and returns exhausted but changed somehow, carrying news, comfort, or simply the stubborn relief of having chosen movement for a few hours. White records treat such absences as nuisance, insolence, or criminality. Another reading is possible. A husband walks 10 miles at night to see his wife on another place, because the law refuses to protect their marriage. That journey is illegal under slavery. Morally, it is an act of devotion. The plantation criminalizes ordinary human commitments, and then acts shocked when people pursue them anyway. More dangerous still are acts that threaten white safety directly. Poisoning rumors circulate widely in slave societies, though actual cases are difficult to measure because white fear inflates stories and evidence is often poor. Arson also haunts planter imagination, especially around gin houses, barns, and crops. Whether every rumor is true matters less than what the fear reveals. Slaveholders know, at some level, that they have made themselves vulnerable by building wealth on coerced labor. They sleep poorly because injustice has a way of sounding like footsteps in the dark. This fear reshapes plantation life. More surveillance, harsher punishments, greater suspicion of gatherings, medicines, and private talk. Ironically, repression can deepen the very resentment it seeks to prevent. The tighter white control becomes, the more value small acts of refusal can take on inside the black community. A person who speaks sharply to an overseer and survives becomes memorable. A woman who hides a beaten man in her cabin for a few hours while he gathers himself becomes brave. Courage on a plantation is not always loud. Sometimes it looks like making room in a crowded bed for someone in danger. Scholars continue to debate how to define resistance under slavery without stretching the term so wide that it loses meaning or narrowing it so much that only armed revolt counts. That debate is useful because it asks important questions. Does preserving family count? Does prayer count? Does slowing labour count? Does surviving without surrendering one's sense of self count? For the people living it, such distinctions may have mattered less than the practical reality. Every day brought choices, and many of those choices involved how much of the self to protect, conceal, share, or spend. You can feel this hidden politics in the quarters at night. Someone is mending by the fire while quietly warning another not to trust a certain driver. Someone else is reciting names so a child will remember kin sold away. A teenage boy practices letters in ash and wipes them away before dawn. A woman laughs at a master's vanity with such perfect restraint that only 3 people catch it, and all 3 need that laugh more than they need an extra biscuit. Resistance is not one mood. It ranges from sorrowful to sly, practical to spiritual, communal to intensely private. The plantation never fully understands this because it keeps mistaking domination for knowledge. White owners believe that because they can count bodies, punish infractions, and read output numbers, they know the people they own. They do not. They know productivity, they know market price, they know how to project authority. They do not know the thoughts passing between 2 sisters shelling peas, or the decision a man makes in the field to save his strength for something more important than pleasing an overseer, or the inward promise a woman repeats to herself while nodding outwardly to a command she despises. That hidden interior is itself a frontier of resistance. No ledger can total it. So what happened to black Americans on Mississippi cotton plantations in 1850 was not only that they suffered under violence and extraction, they also resisted in ways shaped by danger, distance, and daily need. They slowed, concealed, taught, warned, joked, preserved, slipped away, protected one another, and guarded inner judgment against the plantation's demands. The system was brutal enough to force obedience often. It was never complete enough to win the whole person. Power stood in the yard. Defiance lived in the details. Step into the planter's world for a moment and you find something curious. So much polish, so much counting, so much confidence arranged like furniture. The big house is meant to project order. Floors are swept. Silver is rubbed bright. Ledgers are stacked carefully on desks. Letters are folded with neat precision. Guests are welcomed with practiced ease, as if the whole plantation runs on gentility, intelligence, and divine approval. Yet once you look closely, the elegance begins to wobble. Beneath every polished surface sits dependency. The plantation owner likes to imagine himself as the center of everything. He is master, manager, patriarch, entrepreneur, local notable, perhaps even amateur philosopher after 2 glasses of wine. He talks about weather, markets, discipline, yields, politics, and the character of his people, meaning the people he claims to own. He may speak slowly, with the warm gravity of someone who expects to be believed. He may describe slavery as a burden of responsibility, almost a charitable undertaking that requires his firm but benevolent hand. You can hear the self-praise tucked inside the sentence. It is always there. Walk into his office and you meet the true language of the system. Not grand speeches, numbers. Ledgers matter enormously on a cotton plantation in Mississippi in 1850. Pages record acreage planted, tools purchased, debts owed, cotton shipped, prices expected, animals bred, cloth distributed, medical expenses, and human beings reduced to units of labour and value. A person might appear on paper beside a line for mule feed or wagon repair. Name, age, condition, occupation, estimated worth. The writing is clean, the thought behind it is filthy. Paper gives slavery an administrative face, which is one reason slaveholders loved documents so much. Writing makes theft look official. A planter may spend part of the evening with a candle guttering beside him, adding columns, estimating yields, and calculating risk. Cotton price fluctuations matter. Interest on loans matters. River transport matters. The number of healthy field hands matters very much indeed. He may refer to those field hands as part of his capital, his force, his people, or his estate depending on mood and audience. Each phrase reveals something slightly different, yet all point toward the same truth. He cannot imagine his wealth without black labour, but he desperately wants to imagine his own virtue without black suffering. That's the lie sitting at the centre of the desk. Planters in Mississippi often live on borrowed confidence. Land is expensive, expansion is tempting, credit fuels ambition. A man with fertile acres and many enslaved workers may look secure from the porch, but his balance sheet can be much shakier than his manners suggest. A poor harvest, a flood, a drop in cotton prices, illness among workers, or mounting debt can expose the fragility beneath the display. This helps explain some of the plantation class's harshness. Violence is not only ideological, it is financial. A man who sees human beings as leveraged assets will often become more severe when numbers tighten. The parlour and dining room present another face of mastery. Guests are received, candles glow on polished wood, the smell of roast meat, coffee, sugar, and wine drifts through the house. Conversation moves from crops to politics to horseflesh to the latest gossip from Natchez, Vicksburg, New Orleans, or farther east. Men may discuss the rights of states and the rights of property with solemn intensity, meaning above all the right to continue owning black bodies. Women of the planter household may speak of household management, fabrics, garden schemes, children, and church matters while relying on enslaved women for nearly every domestic comfort in sight. Elegance sits on service so completely that it begins to mistake service for nature. You notice how often slaveholders flatter themselves with the language of family. They call themselves fathers to the plantation, guardians of an inferior race, stewards of dependents. It is an astonishing performance. A man can separate a child from its mother and still use paternal language over supper. A woman can ring for an enslaved maid in the middle of the night and still call herself protective of her servants. These people are not confused in a simple sense. They are skilled at moral rearrangement. They redefine cruelty as duty because the truth would make their lives harder to inhabit. One odd little detail from planter culture is the way some owners delighted in comparing crop yields, house designs, dinner service, and horse breeding as if they were gentlemen in a competition of refinement rather than managers of labour camps. There is almost something childish in it. Whose cotton came in strongest? Whose new sideboard came from New Orleans? Whose daughter plays the piano best? Whose table linen was imported? The vanity is not trivial. It reveals how the planter class transformed stolen labour into social theatre. Every bragging right rested on someone else's unpaid work. The mistress of the plantation occupies a complicated place in this world. She's not the legal owner in many cases, though sometimes she may inherit or manage property. She can be subordinate to male authority while still wielding intense power over enslaved women, children, kitchens, linen rooms, and house routines. Her role in the violence of slavery should not be softened by gendered sentiment. She may assign punishments, report behaviour, oversee rations, demand endless domestic labour, and insist on displays of deference that feed her own status. At the same time, she lives inside a patriarchal order that limits her autonomy in ways she may deeply resent. Some white women translate that resentment downward into cruelty. Enslaved people knew this well. Household records expose the daily intimacy of domination. Lists of blankets issued, shoes needed, soap distributed, illness noted, births recorded, deaths entered in plain handwriting. A new child may appear in the books as future property almost before the mother has recovered. A sick labourer may be marked as a temporary loss, like a damaged plough or injured mule, yet the owner also relies on enslaved knowledge to keep these same people alive and productive. An enslaved midwife may deliver babies throughout the plantation. An enslaved healer may treat minor illnesses before a doctor is called. An enslaved cook keeps the owner fed. An enslaved driver maintains field order. Dependence and denial sit side by side in every room. Historians still argue about how much power individual overseers versus owners exercised in shaping day-to-day discipline on Mississippi plantations. Because arrangements varied widely, and surviving sources are often self-serving. Some planters prided themselves on direct control and blamed overseers for excess. Others hid behind overseers while benefiting from every extracted pound of labour. What remains clear is that the structure did not function without continuous management. Slavery required paperwork, scheduling, surveillance, transport, negotiation, and punishment. It was not simply brutality in the field. It was bureaucracy with a whip in its pocket. You can feel that bureaucracy in the morning rounds. The owner or his agent checks on livestock, tools, fences, weather, and labour assignments. Instructions pass outward in calm voices. That calm can be deceptive. A polite sentence from a planter may carry enormous consequences. Sell him, hire her out, move that family to another quarter, increase the picking quota, cut rations for theft, send for the doctor only if the fever worsens. A decision made over breakfast can alter a dozen lives before sunset. Power on a plantation often arrives in ordinary tones. The owner's greatest fantasy is that he made the plantation. He may point to cleared land, drainage ditches, barns, gins, fields, and house grounds as proof of his vision and industry. Yet nearly every visible achievement has been built, maintained, or operated by enslaved black labour. The ditch was dug by them, the fence set by them, the house cleaned by them, the crop planted and picked by them, the meal cooked by them, the children watched by them. Even the owner's image of himself depends on black people behaving according to his script, whether through fear, caution, or exhausted compromise. That dependence creates insecurity, and insecurity breeds obsession. Owners worry about theft, slowness, illness, pregnancy timing, fire, rumour, literacy, and visits between plantations. They worry about debt. They worry about politics in Washington. They worry about abolitionist literature. They worry about rebellious talk from free black communities and news carried by boatmen. Above all, they worry that the people they own do not actually accept the arrangement. On this point, they are correct. A slave society rests on the fact that the enslaved have every reason to desire another life. The dining table and the ledger desk hide this worry imperfectly. It appears in overreaction, in touchy pride, in constant talk about discipline, in suspicion toward gatherings, in the need to be reassured by preachers and politicians that slavery is moral and permanent. A secure system does not have to explain itself so often. The planter class keeps explaining because it feels the cracks. Scholars continue to debate how modern capitalist logic and older paternalist ideology interacted in plantation management. Were planters cold profit seekers using family language as cover, or did many sincerely believe their own household fictions while still behaving brutally? The answer may be that slavery allowed both at once. A man could calculate rates of return in the afternoon and tell himself a comforting story about benevolent guardianship at night. Human beings are capable of astonishing hypocrisy, especially when wealth depends on it. You see another layer of that hypocrisy in the planter's relationship to skill. White owners constantly claimed racial superiority, yet they relied on black expertise in agriculture, craftsmanship, childcare, medicine, navigation, animal handling, and domestic management. They mocked enslaved intelligence while depending on it daily. They feared black autonomy while requiring black judgment every time they looked away. This contradiction ran through the plantation like a hidden crack in a grand staircase. It did not always make the structure fall. It made the structure false. Even leisure in the planter world rests on that falsehood. A carriage ride in the evening, a piano played after supper, a guest entertained with imported liquor, a child tutored on the veranda, a nap taken in the hottest part of the day. Each comfort rests on labour transferred from black bodies to white ease. The owner may feel cultured. The underlying arrangement is still theft. Refinement does not cleanse exploitation. It perfumes it. As night deepens, the big house settles. Lamps burn lower. Papers are stacked. A final entry may be made in a ledger before the book is closed with satisfying firmness. Somewhere outside, in the quarters, someone is still mending, soothing a child, or rubbing sore hands. The owner sleeps under a roof made quiet by control he assumes will continue tomorrow, but the calm is deceptive. His world depends on people who see through him. They know the difference between power and worth. They know how much of his comfort comes from their labour. They know his confidence is padded by constant management and fear. So what happened to black Americans on Mississippi cotton plantations in 1850 cannot be separated from this ruling class of masters, mistresses, clerks, and overseers who built an entire moral vocabulary to excuse what they were doing. They turned people into ledger entries, transformed theft into administration, and draped violence in the fabric of refinement. Yet their supposed mastery was never independent. It leaned every day on the skill, endurance, and knowledge of the very people they tried to reduce to property. The house looked stable. The lie inside it did all the work. By 1850, Mississippi's cotton plantations do not feel temporary. That is part of their menace. The fields are established. The houses are standing. The roads to the river are worn into habit. The ledgers are full. The white families at the top of the system speak as though this order could last forever, as though rows of cotton and rows of cabins were simply the shape of the world. Yet beneath that surface confidence, strain is building. You can feel it in political talk, in slaveholder fear, in the hardening of the laws, and in the constant effort required to keep the whole structure from trembling. The nation beyond the plantation is arguing with increasing heat about slavery, Western expansion, and political power. Planters in Mississippi follow these debates closely, even when they pretend local life remains undisturbed. Newspapers arrive. Letters pass between relatives and business partners. Guests at supper discuss Congress, compromise, tariffs, new territories, fugitive slave laws, and the future of the South. Voices stay polished at first. Then they sharpen. Men who pride themselves on calm begin to sound strained whenever slavery's security is questioned. That tells you something important. Confidence that must be defended so often is not true confidence. For black Americans living on cotton plantations, this tense national atmosphere does not bring immediate relief. The year 1850 is not emancipation. It is not justice. It is not even clear hope in any easy sense. The plantation still runs at dawn. The whip still threatens. The sale block still exists. Yet politics matters because the planter class itself knows the institution is under pressure. A threatened master can become more dangerous. He can also become more anxious, and anxiety changes the air of a place. You notice more watchfulness, more talk about passes, more interest in who travels, who reads, who listens, who visits neighbouring plantations. White people who once spoke lazily about their natural authority may now speak sharply of abolitionists, northern interference and dangerous ideas. Their words reveal a strange mix of arrogance and fear. They still call slavery necessary, moral, and beneficial. At the same time, they behave like people guarding something fragile. Both cannot be equally true. Though many of them will insist they are, this fragility shows in economics as well. Cotton is powerful, but it is not peace. The whole plantation order rests on prices, weather, credit, and labour discipline. A field can look abundant and still leave an owner stretched thin if debts are heavy. A family may seem wealthy while borrowing against next year's crop. The system expands because men dream of greater returns, but expansion often brings more loans, more land clearing, more purchases of enslaved workers, more dependence on favourable markets, and therefore more fear when anything shifts. In public, planters talk like emperors. In private, many calculate like gamblers. Black Americans on these plantations live inside that unstable stability. They know the white class is powerful. They also know the white class is uneasy. A person who spends years under domination becomes skilled at reading small signs. The owner drinks more than usual. The overseer grows harsher after a letter arrives. The mistress complains about expenses. A trader visits twice in 1 month. 2 young men are sold. Extra cotton is pushed to market quickly. Such things do not require a newspaper to understand. People in the quarters can often feel financial strain before they know its full cause. The fear of sale hangs especially heavy in this period. Enslaved people understand that debt, death, inheritance disputes, and ambition can all pull families apart. A child born on a Mississippi plantation in 1850 enters a world where kinship exists under constant threat from paper decisions made in town offices or at dining tables. A husband may fear not only punishment, but transfer. A mother may fear not only hunger, but separation. The whole family structure has courage in it because it persists without legal shelter. Love under these conditions is both ordinary and brave. There is also a larger historical pressure gathering beneath plantation life. The enslaved are not passive spectators to national conflict. They hear things. They interpret rumours. They notice when white conversation changes. Boatmen, peddlers, travellers, hired workers, ministers, and newspapers all carry fragments of the wider world into Mississippi. Not everyone gets the same information. Much of it is partial or distorted. Still, the knowledge that slavery is being argued over beyond the plantation matters. It suggests that the owner's version of reality is not the only one in existence. Historians still argue over how much political awareness about national debates reached enslaved communities in particular local settings, because evidence varies and white sources often underestimated black understanding. But scholars agree that enslaved people were often keen interpreters of politics when politics touched slavery, which it always did. They did not need full access to formal debate to grasp the stakes. They only needed enough to know that the world outside the plantation was not silent. That knowledge could be dangerous and sustaining at once. Dangerous, because hope can provoke harsher surveillance. Sustaining, because even uncertain possibility widens the imagination. A woman in the quarters may not know the precise details of legislation passed far away, but she may know that white people are angry and unsettled for reasons larger than the weather. A man walking behind a wagon may not have seen a map of the territories, yet he may hear enough to understand that the future of slavery is being fought over. These are not trivial perceptions. They shape how people judge the moment they are living in. At the same time, plantation life keeps forcing attention back to the immediate. Food must be cooked. Children must be soothed. Cotton must be picked. Illness must be treated. A wedding may be whispered into existence with no legal force behind it. A burial may take place under a few trees with prayer and grief but little public acknowledgement. Life on a Mississippi plantation in 1850 is lived at two scales at once. The national crisis is growing. The pot still has to be stirred tonight. There is a painful irony in the planter class's response to growing tension. Instead of re-examining the cruelty at the heart of the system, many become more committed to it. They defend slavery with louder voices, more elaborate theories, and increasingly rigid social expectations. Some move from calling it a regrettable necessity to praising it as a positive good. That shift tells you how deeply they have bound their identity to domination. When a person profits from injustice long enough, he may stop merely excusing it and begin loving the excuse itself. The enslaved see the consequences in daily life. Masters grow touchier about deference. Patrols become more alert. Religious gatherings draw more suspicion. Literacy appears even more threatening. Discussions of runaway attempts or possible conspiracies take on a sharper tone. White fear does not make the plantation weaker in the short term. Often it makes it harder, colder, more demanding. Systems under moral pressure rarely become kinder on their own. Yet there is another force inside this same moment, and it lives in memory, endurance, and the simple fact that black Americans continue to imagine lives beyond the plantation story about them. People remember parents sold away. They remember childhood places in other states, or they remember names, recipes, songs, and marriages not recognized by law. They remember every lie told by owners who call themselves guardians. Memory under slavery is not nostalgia. It is evidence. It says this is not the only world that has existed, and therefore not the only world that can exist. Children growing up in 1850 absorb this evidence in fragments. They hear adults lower their voices around certain subjects. They learn which family members live on other plantations. They notice which white men are talked about with dread. They pick up place names like Natchez, New Orleans, Memphis, Virginia, Carolina, river, town, market, free. These words gather meaning slowly. A generation raised inside Mississippi's cotton economy is also being raised inside a national argument over its future. No child can fully know what is coming, but many can feel that the adults are carrying more than ordinary tiredness. One curious detail of this era is how much white Southern rhetoric about honor, stability, and civilization intensified just as sectional conflict deepened. The louder the claims of permanence, the more uncertain the ground beneath them seems to have been. Plantation society kept staging itself as timeless while history was already moving under its feet. That theatrical quality matters. It means the grand confidence of 1850 was, in part, a performance given against gathering dread. Scholars continue to debate whether the crisis that would erupt into civil war was already inevitable in 1850, or whether alternate political paths still remained open. That question belongs partly to legislatures and presidents, but from the plantation ground the answer feels simpler. A social order built on human bondage, family separation, forced labour, and routine violence was carrying within it a conflict too deep to stay politely contained forever. Whether the break came sooner or later, the strain was real in the cabins, fields, churches, roads, and counting rooms of Mississippi. And so the final truth of this moment is not only suffering, though there is more than enough of that. It is also pressure toward change, however dimly perceived. Black Americans on cotton plantations in Mississippi in 1850 are living in the center of a system that appears mighty yet cannot stop justifying itself, cannot stop fearing those it enslaves, and cannot stop relying on labor it has no moral right to command. Their daily lives remain harsh, monitored, and vulnerable. Their future is uncertain, but uncertainty cuts both ways. It threatens them. It also threatens the world built on their bondage. That world does not know it yet, or refuses to know it fully. The cotton still moves, the ledgers still fill, the porch lamps still glow at evening, yet the silence around the plantation is not true silence. It is the hush before a larger storm in American history, one fed by every acre planted, every body sold, every family divided, every prayer whispered under trees, every small act of refusal hidden inside ordinary days. The plantation imagines itself permanent. Human beings living under it have reasons to imagine otherwise. That matters because slavery always tried to control not only the body, but the horizon. It wanted to decide what the future could be. It wanted children born into bondage to think bondage was the shape of all possible life. It wanted adults to measure every hope against punishment until hope itself felt foolish. Yet hope survived in practical forms, in a mother teaching names, in a father walking miles at night to keep a marriage alive, in a song carrying more than one meaning, in a man slowing his hoe because even a fraction of a gesture could remain his own, in a woman keeping judgment alive behind a lowered gaze. These things do not look like history when they happen. They are history. So what happened to black Americans on cotton plantations in Mississippi in 1850 was both immediate and immense. They endured one of the most profitable and brutal labor systems in the modern world. They were bought, sold, worked, watched, measured, and denied lawful claim to their own time and kin. At the same moment, they preserved community, memory, spirituality, skill, humor, and forms of resistance that exposed the weakness inside the master's confidence. They stood in the center of a cotton empire that believed itself rich and permanent, even as the deeper truth of that empire was carrying the nation toward rupture. Now the night grows gentler. The road fades into shadow. The last heat lifts from the dirt. Frogs call from the low fields, and the pine trees hold their dark stillness against the sky. In the quarters, the fires have burned down to embers. The cabins are quieter now. A mother has finally settled a restless child. An old man has stopped coughing for a little while. Somewhere a pot rests empty beside the hearth. Somewhere a pair of worn hands lies open in sleep, no longer gripping hoe, sack, or spoon. You let the plantation drift farther away, not because its history is small, but because your body is ready for rest. The fields soften in the darkness. The hard voices fall silent. Even the big house loses its sharp edges and becomes only another shape under the moon. You are left with the softer human things that outlast the noise of power, a whispered prayer, a remembered name, a hand laid lightly on a child's back, the low murmur of a song that asks for deliverance and gives comfort in the asking. The night air smells of earth after heat, wood ash, and distant water. Crickets keep their steady rhythm. Leaves stir once, then settle. You breathe a little slower. The weight of the story begins to loosen, not because it was easy, but because you can set it down now. Let the cotton fields fade into mist. Let the ledgers close. Let the lanterns go out one by one. Let the people who carried so much return, at least here, to a place of quiet dignity in your mind. And as the dark deepens, you can rest with this final image. Not the scale, not the whip, not the porch of the master's house, just a soft southern night, a few stars above the trees, and the calm knowledge that even in the harshest places, human beings kept hold of one another, of memory, and of the hope that the world could someday be otherwise.